Friday night, around 9:30 p.m. I was home. My wife, Terry, had called earlier to say she'd be staying late at work. When the next call came, it wasn't unexpected, but the conversation certainly was. She said what she needed to, and I responded with a firm no. Not just no, but hell no. I added, "There's a diamond cab in the parking lot. Number 127. You have 30 minutes to be home. The ride from your place is 25 minutes. If you're not here on time, have the driver take you to your mother's house." She said nothing during my tirade. The only sound I heard was her exasperated sigh. Without another word, I hung up, took the phone off the hook, and turned off my cell phone. I sat in my favorite chair, book in hand, but I couldn't concentrate. The minutes dragged, and at 29.5, I got up to lock the front door and secure the burglary chain. Just as I reached the door, a cab slowly pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, shouting something to the driver. Something about how she could have walked faster than he drove. I walked out, handed him a $25 tip, and we shared a knowing smile before he drove off. She stormed into the house, slammed the door shut, locked it, and slid the chain into place. Meanwhile, I grabbed a beer from the cooler on the porch, sat in my rocking chair, and waited. When I finished my drink, she still hadn't come outside. Deciding I'd waited long enough, I climbed into the cab of my work truck, reclined the seat, cracked the windows, and turned on the CD player. Let me introduce myself. I'm George Rout. My friends call me Gro. The G in my name is unpronounceable, but we've all made peace with that. Terry, my wife, refuses to be called Mrs. Trout. She thinks it's silly, and that's fine. I'm a master plumber, and she works as a secretary in a small office. The next morning, Terry found me asleep in my truck. She'd been looking for me for almost an hour. For some reason, she was still wearing the same clothes from the night before. That might have had something to do with the fact that our bedroom door was locked. Then again, it could have been because all her clothes were packed into garbage bags and locked in the back of my truck. When she started squealing, I let her rant until she finally paused. The smirk on my face seemed to stop her short. When she saw it, I asked, "Are you done being embarrassed for now?" She started to argue again but glanced around, realizing our neighbors were keenly observing the spectacle. I grinned, reached for the fridge, and grabbed a Diet Coke. No need to dull my brain cells with another beer. As I sipped my drink, Flower of Scotland began playing on the CD player. I turned it up. I've always loved the sound of bagpipes. She retreated into the house without shutting the door. When the song ended, I followed her inside, closing the door behind me. She sat on one end of the couch, stewing. Ignoring her, I went to the kitchen, grabbed the bag of donuts I'd left there the night before, and started eating. She hates donuts. When she finally joined me in the kitchen, I offered her one. Her glare could have killed. I watched her silently, tilting my head like a curious dog, smirking all the while. Eventually, she broke the silence. "How did you know where I was last night?" "You told me," I replied. Her face was a masterpiece of shock and confusion. "I never said a word about it." I leaned back, savoring her discomfort. "Would you believe me if I said you talked in your sleep?" "I know this was the 4th meeting with James. The first time you held hands. The second time you let him play with your leg. The third time you made out with him in the parking lot for 12 minutes before coming home. Want to hear more?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No," she continued, eyes downcast. "I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I called and asked if I could spend the night with him." Then, as if trying to make sense of her actions, she added, "At the time, I thought it's what I wanted. But looking back, I realize how stupid I was. Love you. I only want you." I leaned forward, letting her words sink in before responding. "I still love you, Terry. But the trust in our marriage is shattered. It's going to take time for me to trust you again." She asked if she could get into the bedroom to take a bath and change. I asked where she'd slept the previous night. "In the guest room," she admitted. "Well, you can keep sleeping there," I said flatly. "Your clothes are in the back of my truck. You can take them out and put them in the guest room. That's where you'll be living for the foreseeable future." She looked at me as though I'd spoken a foreign language. "I'm your wife. I'm not sleeping in the guest room." "You're very close to being my ex-wife," I countered. "You'll stay in the guest room, or I'll drive to your mother's house and dump your stuff in her yard." By the time I finished speaking, I was yelling. She was crying. I stayed calm as she eventually agreed to move her things. I unlocked the truck, but when she disappeared inside, I unloaded the rest myself. When I called out that the truck was empty, she ran to retrieve her things. Unfortunately for her, the sprinklers turned on just as she grabbed the last bag. Soaked and humiliated, she marched back into the house. Later that day, her phone rang. I overheard her apologizing to James for running out of the restaurant. She told him it was a mistake that I'd found out, and that she couldn't see him again. His voice grew louder and angrier until she hung up and turned off her phone. As I watched her, I remembered a secret from our honeymoon. A hypnotist performing at a magic show had put her under and, as a joke, told me the magic phrase to hypnotize her again. He assured me she wouldn't remember, and to this day, she doesn't know I have that power. But now, I was beginning to wonder if I might need to use it to fix what was broken. Friday night, around 9:30 p.m., I sat in my favorite chair, the evening calm except for the slight unease that tugged at my thoughts. Earlier, my wife, Terry, had called to say she'd be working late. It wasn't entirely unexpected. After all, late nights weren't rare in her line of work. But when she called again, her voice carrying a subtle hesitation, my gut told me something wasn't right. "I need to stay out a bit longer," she said. "No," I replied sharply. "Not just no, hell no. There's a diamond cab in the parking lot, number 127. You have 30 minutes to be home. The ride from wherever you are takes 25. If you're not here on time, tell the driver to drop you at your mother's house instead." A sigh was all I heard before the line went dead. After hanging up, I unplugged the landline, powered down my cell phone, and settled back into my chair with the book I'd been reading. But focus eluded me. Minutes dragged by as my mind raced, imagining every possible scenario. When 29.5 minutes passed, I rose, intending to lock the front door. Just as my hand touched the latch, a cab pulled into the driveway. She stepped out in a rush, yelling at the driver, something about how she could have walked faster. I walked out to meet them, handed the driver a generous tip, and exchanged knowing smiles before he drove away. Terry stormed past me, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She added the chain for good measure, but I was too weary to argue. I grabbed a beer from the cooler on the porch and sat down in the rocking chair, letting the night air calm me. When the beer was gone, she still hadn't emerged. Resigned, I climbed into my work truck, reclined the seat, and put on some music. Bagpipes filled the cabin as "Flower of Scotland" played, the notes a strange comfort in the chaos of the evening. The next morning, she found me asleep in the truck. Judging by her face, she'd been looking for a while. She was still in the same clothes from the night before, likely because the bedroom door had been locked, and her wardrobe was packed into garbage bags secured in the back of my truck. "What's this about?" she demanded. I looked at her, a smirk tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Oh, have you stopped being embarrassed long enough to talk?" Her response was sharp, but she hesitated when she noticed neighbors peering curiously from their windows. I ignored her glare, grabbed a Diet Coke, and let her stew in silence. Eventually we sat down and really talked. She tried to explain, to make sense of her actions, to apologize. But trust, once cracked, is a fragile thing. I told her I loved her, but things would be different now. She'd be staying in the guest room until further notice. If her belongings weren't out of my truck by Monday morning, I'd personally deliver them to her mother's house, or Goodwill. She protested, of course, but I was firm. When she finally started unloading her things, I dumped the rest onto the lawn and reminded her about the sprinklers, which promptly turned on, soaking her and the last of her bags. Over the next few weeks, the truth unraveled like a tangled thread. Her behavior, her late nights, they all led back to a man named James. He worked as a salesman for a company owned by my friend Roger. James was sloppy, arrogant, and careless, and it wasn't long before Roger fired him for falsifying expense reports. I tracked their movements through GPS and phone records, piecing together the story of their brief, misguided affair. But things took a darker turn when James, desperate and enraged, abducted Terry from her workplace. I followed them to a dingy motel at the edge of town, Buttercup, my massive Mastiff Wolfhound mix, by my side. James and his accomplices never stood a chance. Buttercup and I stormed the room, scattering them like leaves in the wind. By the time the police arrived, Terry was safe and the men were subdued, some far worse off than others. In the aftermath, Terry and I faced a long road to rebuild what was broken. She was shaken but grateful, her love for me reaffirmed in the face of her mistakes. Buttercup, my loyal protector, became her constant companion, earning a place in her heart and even his own room in the house. Years passed and our family grew. We had 6 children, 4 boys who took after me and 2 tall, graceful girls who mirrored their mother. Buttercup lived a full, happy life, and his legacy carried on through his offspring, who became loyal guardians of our home and business. Life moved forward. The plumbing company I worked for became mine, and we rebranded it to Best Friend Plumbing in honor of Buttercup. Business thrived, and Terry and I found a new rhythm, one rooted in trust, understanding, and the hard lessons of our past. Today we're still together, surrounded by family and the memories of a life rebuilt. The locks I bought all those years ago still sit in the garage, a silent reminder of the storm we weathered and the peace we ultimately found.